Hello everyone. Today we'll be talking about how to create a removable die scan, and we are currently using the 3Shape Dental Manager. And in order to start our case, we have to start a new case with this order form. I'll just be putting in my last name, and we will be selecting the teeth we want to work on. You can select all of the teeth or just certain ones. For our purposes, I'm just going to show a couple teeth just so we get an idea of how this works. Now, it is important to realize that the teeth are labeled by the quadrant and then what number they are. So this would be number 11, 1, 1. And then moving on here would be 2, 1, 2, 3, 2, 4, 2, 5, 2, 6, 2, 7. That's just important to keep in mind that it is not using the universal naming, and it is just using the quadrant along with what tooth number. Once we select the teeth, we're just going to say that the anatomy, crown, and in order to choose our antagonist, we're saying it's an antagonist model. So this will require us to also scan the lower arch. You can choose to say no antagonist because we're just doing a scan, but just to show what a scan with occlusion looks like, we'll be selecting antagonist model. Once that's prepared, we can press scan and it'll start processing. Now the software has us in our scanning manager. Right here, it is saying that we need to scan the upper jaw. We currently have our upper jaw mounted on a plate just like this. So we'll be taking that arch and placing it onto our scanning plate. Our model is now on our scanning plate. It is now placed inside of the machine. It'll start automatically scanning so we can get a preliminary scan. It is now asking us to set an annotation on tooth 16. Tooth 16 would be in the first quadrant over here on the right, and then you count down to the sixth tooth. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's asking us to do a dot at the margin of the buccal side, so we just left click right there. Now it's asking for tooth 11, so that would be normally tooth 8. It's our right maxillary incisor. Now it's asking for tooth 25. Tooth 25 would be our second premolar. Once those are picked, you can now move on to the next button, or I also have to pick 26. Now we have our scan right here. We can increase to have a full detailed scan of the full model if we just select right here to select all, just so we can get a nice scan of the full arch. We press next, and now it's doing an adaptive scan of the full model. We have adaptive scan settings right here, and these iterations dictate how many times it'll do a detailed adaptive scan of the full arch. We set it to 2, so that means every time we do an adaptive scan and get full detail, it'll scan 2 times. So now this will take 2 full scans of our arch to get a nice, beautiful scan. So now that we have our 2 iterations chosen, we can go back and see if there's any issues with the scan, any major holes. These red areas mean that there were scans taken. Anytime there's a hole, that means there is no scanning info on that area. When it's red, it just means it's insufficient. It doesn't understand the geometry or the texture there. It didn't get a good enough scan. But because we are taking individual scans of each tooth as well, these areas interproximally do not matter too much at this moment. So we'll be moving on. So we will cancel our adaptive scan and select next. We can also trim at this stage if needed. We could also do this in another stage of the process where we move on to another software before printing. But here at this stage, we can get a lot of this gunk out of the way. So I'm happy with that. We're going to press next. Now it is asking for us to load our lower jaw into the scanner. So all you do is remove the upper arch with its mounting base, and we already pre-mounted our lower arch on a separate base. So once that is clicked in, the scanner will start to scan our lower arch. We now have our preliminary scan, and because we don't have any teeth on the lower arch that we'll be scanning separately, we do not need to annotate where particular teeth are. So it already fully highlighted this arch for us to do an adaptive scan. So now, because we have our setting at 2 iterations, it will take 2 adaptive scanning iterations of this arch and give us the result afterwards. So we press next. So now we have our lower arch fully scanned. We can press on this detailed adaptive scanning to see which areas are missing. This scan doesn't matter too much for our purposes. We will not be really using the arch at all. We have all of the teeth, their main surfaces scanned, and the interproximal areas are mostly scanned, and any detail that is missing will be made up with the dies if we were to be using individual dies for the lower arch, but we are just using it as a base for our upper arch. So we do not need to continue with extra scans. So we'll be moving on to trimming this. I just want to do a nice clean cut under. Might trim a little more with this line tool right here. And it is nice and clean. So we can move on. Now it is asking for us to get a scan of our arches in occlusion. We'll be continuing on to mount our mandible on top of our, or under our maxilla with just a little bit of blue tack. Here we have our maxilla mounted on top of our mandible using some blue tack just in between the teeth on the occlusal surfaces. Now, the protrusion of the blue tack is not an issue in this point. This is just because the machine wants to know what the arches look like in occlusion. Once we have that, we have our base mounted with blue tack. We just insert it into the scanner and it will start to auto scan. We now have our scan. It's just doing a very fast scan so we can get the occlusion looked at. The computer takes a while to process over here. It is trying to understand the geometry of the occlusion, and we might have to manually set what occlusion looks like with our preliminary scans. It can try to automatically put our arches into occlusion. Let's see if it was able to do so. So here we got an error. It has an issue with aligning our occlusion. So we might have to manually adjust it. Here's what it tried to come up with, but we will manually do our occlusion. So right here, here's our lower arch. So we have our bite scan and we have our lower arch scan. We can use either just a single dot to get them to line up. So we would put the same dot on the same area between the two teeth, and it can align them as so. So we'll use that one for the lower one. Now we still have an issue over here, so we'll manually align our upper arch. For this one, let us use our 3-dot technique. You would be placing these 3 dots along our arch scan as well as our bite scan. You have to get these in alignment, so we will be following the same dot pattern. So I have one over here on the incisor, and then I did one over here on the canine. So I'll put a dot right here up on the canine. And let's see how our alignment looks. It is meshed in together well. So that's all you're looking for, is for them to be in alignment with each other. As long as you see the same amount of, meshing, so the purple and the, clay color, then you know that it is aligned pretty good. So now we can see our alignment results. This looks correct to me. So we will continue on. Now we get into the die scanning. We have our multi-die scanning platform, which we will load our teeth into. The important thing to note is to remember that die 16 actually refers to not tooth number 16 as we know it, but instead, when we are looking at our occlusion, we have quadrant 1, and then this would be tooth 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what we know as tooth number 3 is actually die 16. Die 11 would be our number 8, the right central incisor, and we'll be setting these up as so. So here is our multi-die scanning plate. We have our teeth mounted with the buccal side towards the front. The front would be this rounded edge, and that will scan in right there. Just to show, here is the same alignment as it is requesting. So tooth number 16, which is our first, or our, yeah, first molar, is right there. And then we have our central incisor, we have our second premolar, and we have our first molar on the left side. So that will go into our E4, and it will get a preliminary scan. Here's our E4 doing our preliminary scan. It is getting the teeth, and it is checking for any holes in the scan, anything that it is not able to scan. It is important to make sure that you have enough blue tack mounted to the base plate of whatever base you're using, just so that the dies or whatever model you're using, such as this, they do not move while scanning. So you just want to make sure they are securely mounted. My preference in scanning with multiple dies, what I do is I have these screw, such as that, inside of the tooth, and then I place it within our scanner with a bunch of blue tack already in our multi-die scanner. So here we have our screen, and it is just completing the mesh. It is processing over here. So here are the dies which we have scanned. These are the teeth, and it got a very nice clean scan of these. If I saw any holes, I would do a more detailed scan and just keep rescanning until it is able to fully fill in these models. But yes, we got a very nice scan of these. So we will be moving on. You can trim these, say it got a little bit of blue tack selected, then we would clean it up. We can get rid of this area right here just by setting it as lower than the rest and doing a cut such as this. Now all of these have a angled base. If I wanted to fix that, I would actually make it so that the bases are more flat. So let me undo that. Here they are flatter, and let's try something like this. So now I've got a more crisp cut. It barely took off anything, which is what we're looking for. And these are just how they were scanned. A little bit of an angle over here. But we will move on now. Now the system is trying to align the dies where they were with our original scan. So here's our arch, and it's actually having an issue trying to place this tooth into occlusion. It, place it over the wrong tooth. This tooth actually belongs here. So we will press this to manually align tooth 16. So we'll just press on the margin over there, and we will press on the margin over here on our arch scan. And it will align it pretty well. Let's see if it can do the next one on its own, and it did. Here's our incisor. Now the next tooth, it also had an issue with alignment. Even though it looks good to me, let's press this. We'll just do right center of that, and we'll press the center of it right here. And let's see, yes, we have a good alignment right there. And we also have alignment failed over here with 26. For some reason, it's also trying to mesh into that same 25. So let's take care of that right now. Press the dots. You want to get it as close as possible, but it doesn't have to be spot on. And it will get it into alignment as needed, like that. So we can continue on, and here's an inspection showing our teeth in occlusion, and it looks great to me. Even though it says scans are saved right here, I just like to move on to the design phase just to ensure that the scans are fully saved. You can tell if they've been saved if it lets you work on those scans now in this design center. So it is loading it up right here. Once it's fully loaded, I just like to cancel out of the design center. So here's our teeth. Here's where we can design any new preps we want to do, any restorations, but I just X out. And I do not want to save our design. We have a limited amount of designs, it says. I don't like to waste those for nothing, so I'm not saving that. Saying it didn't make any output files, but those files were from the design center. But if we want to continue into our newest scan, which is right here, we can open this up and let's just check it out. Wrong button. Pressing 3D preview will show us what our scan looks like. So once this loads up, we'll be able to see what we have scanned and how it looks, if it would load anytime soon. Here we go. So if I go over here and I right click on this form, this order right here, which is what we just scanned, if I continue on to advanced, and if I press export scan right over here, we'll actually be able to export our scan as an STL instead of DCM. DCM is the proprietary file format that 3Shape likes to use, and unfortunately we cannot use it with our other software, but we can export it as an STL file, and we'll just call this, so this would be our lower arch, and our antagonist that we just did, we'll just call this lower antagonist, and we want to make sure that we export it as an STL. And then with our upper prep, it'll automatically pop up. So we'll just say upper prep scan and ensure that you are still in STL, and then you will save this as well. So now we fully exported our scan, which we just took. If everything goes according to plan, we can always delete these just to free up space, but we do not need these scans anymore as we exported them as an STL mesh file.